All right, hello everyone. I am still working on going through chapter 3 of The Conquest of Bread, so that video is kind of still being prepared. A lot of really bad non-arguments in chapter 3. It's pretty bad. But I thought we'd do something a little fun today. There was a video that kind of making the rounds a couple of months ago by Tim Cain. Tim Cain is a game developer, programmer, designer. His best known stuff that he had like a really important creative part in is like Fallout 1 and 2, Arcanum, The Outer Worlds, stuff like that. He's a pretty solid voice as far as like game design goes. He's one of the people that created some pretty memorable and well produced and well good games. He has this video, and the title of the video, I'll put a link in the description, is "Do Devs Know What Gamers Want?" And his answer is basically a hard no with some arguments. Now, I'm not going to try to... the goal here is not to like debunk his video, because he does make some good points. But I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because he's looking at it from kind of a design standpoint, and I think he's missing out on some of the things that... people who might loosely be, in the developers, people with entrepreneurial skill might actually know about what gamers want. And I think we can bring a little bit of economics into this and maybe learn something too. So, game development, and I'm talking about game development as opposed to my arguments are going to kind of be applicable to any like large scale commercial entertainment production. So it would probably work for movies and things like that as well, as long as, things are not too over-engineered by, like, a government or something like that. Game development is a roundabout economic task. It requires all kinds of different stuff: labor, capital, entrepreneurship. All of these things are needed to put together a game and to figure out whether a potential game project might be popular or profitable. Of course, labor and capital do the actual production, right? We have computers, we have artists, we have designers, we have writers, we have, all the different tools that these people use in order to produce the stuff that goes into the game. And so you might say, well, what the heck is entrepreneurship doing here? And, well, entrepreneurship actually does have a pretty important role in the production of any large commercial object, right? So, for instance, what are the things that entrepreneurs do early in the process? Well, they would do things like estimate the potential audience size. They would attempt to synthesize and apply market information. They would attempt to decide what a reasonable budget for a project might be. And they actually do have quite a bit of information about what people actually want. And this is one of the places where I think Tim Cain goes a little bit wrong, because he focuses a lot on what people say and not so much what they do. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Later in the process, entrepreneurs still have a effect, right? Once the overall game shape is kind of set, they can have a role in deciding whether they should do expansions or whether they should fund a sequel. And in these cases, things like the existing audience becomes even more important, because now you actually have real data. I mean, there's a concept in economics called... Oh, and by the way, before I move on to the next topic, if you want to learn more about entrepreneurship, one of the people that's spending a lot of time doing really good studies on economics is a guy named Per Bylund. He works often with the Mises Institute, but I think he's a professor of his own somewhere. I forget where. But he wrote this little book called How to Think About the Economy, a Primer, which for an introductory economics text actually has quite a bit on entrepreneurship. He does a lot of talks, a lot of articles, lot of book chapters about entrepreneurship. It's really his thing, and so I'll post a link to his author page over at the Mises Institute, so that you can dig deeper into his works on entrepreneurship. That might be fun if you find this interesting. So there's a concept in economics called demonstrated preference versus stated preference. What people, the kind of most basic way to describe this is that what people have bought is better information than what they say they'll buy. This could either be an audience of a previous game in a series, or an audience of another game that hasn't saturated the market. For example, it's been a while since it came out, and there aren't a lot of copycats kind of flooding the market. The thing that we learn basically from this is that when you have a new idea, that idea might be really amazing, right? But you don't know yet. You don't have anyone who's shown yet that they're willing to pay for it. And so even if the idea turns out to be a $1 billion IP, right? It's still true that until it's proven to be that, you should start with a low budget for new ideas and look for higher return on investment. This is something that a lot of large game companies don't do, right? They grow large through the production of a series. Think of any of Bethesda's series, Elder Scrolls or the FPS later Fallout games, right? They build up these series and then they produce a one-off game or a game on a new IP. And what they try to do is they try to give that new game kind of a comparable budget to stuff that they're throwing at their flagship series. And the problem with that, of course, is that until you know that people are willing to pay for it, it might end up wasting a lot of money on something that people just don't want. And, that's always a risk in government, or not the government. That's always a risk in production, right? That your entrepreneur doesn't know what he's talking about, or that you misjudge the market on something. But it's not really much worse for video games than it is for anything else. So, just kind of like a case study, we have a game, a super popular game called Vampire Survivors, right? This game came out and it was $3. And it had this tiny budget. It used a lot of reworked sprites from Castlevania games and stuff. And it was just kind of a really neat little, you walk around and build up weapons and shoot bad guys and it was a very simple game, and it ended up selling millions of copies, I think, to the point where once they actually had an idea that we actually have a market, then they had to start thinking about what can we add to this in order to increase our market, or just to kind of give some value to people who've already bought the game. And so it's not that they produced Reptile Survivors and went off and made it a RPG dating sim, right? No, what they did was they said, okay, we have this thing, people have bought it, and so what we'll do is we'll produce things that we think that we think also would appeal to the same audience that is already playing the game, and maybe we'll get some more people in there. But the goal is to capitalize on this audience that has shown through demonstrated preference that they're interested in our product. It was a small investment that had a huge payoff. And if what they had done instead was try to create something much larger to begin with, something much more ambitious to begin with, they might never have finished. Or maybe they wouldn't have met the expectations that they set in their audience, and they would have kind of floundered that way. Tim Cain's video, he talks a lot about player feedback. These are stated preferences, not demonstrated preferences. It's the guy saying, I want better resolution, I want cleaner textures, I want whatever. Stated preferences can be useful, but from an entrepreneurial perspective, they're much less important than demonstrated preferences. These surveys can be helpful sometimes, but it's not a substitute for actual sales data. An existing market is always way more valuable than surveys that suggest that there might be a market somewhere, basically, is the bottom line. So, kind of rule number one that a lot of these big game companies seem to be failing at is don't betray your existing audience, however it is that you envision that audience. We have a lot of producers that are saying, "Oh, well, we're aiming for a new audience. We're trying to aim at this audience over here," and doing so is always a risk. I mean, anytime you add new features, this is something Tim Cain talks about correctly. Anytime you talk about new features, you need more money to produce them. Any large-scale roundabout production needs an idea of what its budget should be like, because what you basically have to do is say, well, we're going to do this project, and it's going to take a year. It's going to cost, X dollars, and we expect a return of Y. And you need to make sure that your return is larger than X plus whatever you would get from investing X dollars into, something that is very low risk, right? Usually that's kind of like the interest rate, basically. The role of entrepreneurs in large roundabout processes is to estimate this. And so the way you can get around the need for entrepreneurial services, basically, is by either making something that's not very roundabout, right? It's something that you make today and hand out tomorrow, and you get really immediate feedback about whether there's a demand for it or not, right? Or it can be something that's really small, and you only invest a little bit into it, and you throw it out there and you say, does anyone want this? Tim Cain, I don't know that much about the guy, but, I did a video recently about, like, Mises' concept of the creative genius. And I would say Tim Cain probably lies closer to that creative genius than the entrepreneur. That's just kind of my guess. Because he's the guy that was like, oh yeah, let's make this game that does this cool thing. It's a kind of a new idea. It's like, it's not even, the reason I don't put him all the way on creative genius, right, is because you kind of look at Fallout and you're like, well, it's kind of like a sequel to Wasteland in some ways, right? So you're like, well, he wasn't like treading new ground necessarily, 100% new ground, but he did some cool things with, what he was doing, and he definitely has had kind of a good creative, effect on a few games, a few very popular and very good games. So we'll give him that, right? But since Tim's not an entrepreneur so much, it's not necessarily in his wheelhouse to estimate these kinds of things. Creative geniuses might not have the skill to do entrepreneurial work as well. They might indeed be focused on some kind of particular thing that they're working on more than anything else. But the point is that if you don't betray your existing audience, then you can use those previous sales as a baseline. The problem is that if you do betray that existing audience, then your previous sales figures are not a good baseline for what you can expect to make from your new thing that appeals to who knows who. It's worth pointing out that that there's actually a nice workaround that's come recently in the last decade or two to this process that can actually give you demonstrated preference information before you produce anything. And that process is crowdfunding. This is something that where it's closer to a loan, right? You're offering an idea to someone, and you invest a little bit in kind of selling the idea, right? You get some art done, you get some concept sketches, you get some essays written by designers about what they want to put into it, kind of thing. And then from that limited small investment, you put that out there, and you use whatever pull you happen to have, and you say, does anyone want this? It's not done, but if we get enough funding, then we'll do it. And so you crowdfund something, and this gets people to actually put money on the table for it, right? And so, you're kind of, if you're doing it right, if you're being a good crowdfunder, you're kind of accepting these pledges as a loan, right? In the sense that, like, yes, I'm going to produce something and you're going to get something eventually. But that gives you an idea of what kind of budget you can have. We've seen cases of games basically doing crowdfunding, making massive money, and then kind of going off into development hell forever. And that's something that you got to try to avoid if you want to maintain, a loyal and happy audience. Basically you have to have a clear roadmap, or you can end up veering away from that original vision and end up losing that audience. So we've talked about demonstrated preferences, and that's all well and good, but of course, you can't just produce the same game over and over again, right? And so you're going to have to make some changes with the game to make a sequel or even a spiritual successor, right? So I came up with a couple of examples of how to do this, or how this has been done historically from the gaming industry. And one of them is perhaps one of my favorite series of all time, Ultima, right? Ultima 1 was done basically entirely by Richard Garriott, I believe, by himself, right? In fact, I think the first 2 or 3 of them were just done by him. Something like that. I'm a little foggy on that history, but fair enough. And, it was a computer RPG. It established some fundamentals. Most of the game is played from like kind of a top-down perspective. There's some occasional first-person, very rough first-person segments. The aesthetic of the game is largely medieval with some late-game science fiction elements. Very colorful, but very low detail, right? If you look at like the character icon from the first Ultima game, it's It's colorful, but there's no nose or face or eyes or anything. It's just kind of it's marginally better than a stick figure, basically. So he created Ultima 1. Ultima 1, people liked it. People like, oh, cool, I like this. This is fun. I'll pay for this. I'll buy it. He sold it on he sold a bunch of it to people. And he said, okay, well, this is the audience I have. If I make Ultima 2, what I do is I am going to kind of keep a lot of similar things in there so that my audience will say, okay, this is the next one in the series, and there's some improvements, and there's some changes, but all in all, I still believe that this is being faithful to, the previous game that I loved and purchased and put money down for, right? Ultima 2 keeps the similar look. A lot of people, if you go looking around for Ultima 2 footage, you'll see a lot of the PC version, which I for some reason has much simpler graphics than I think the Apple II version has, and possibly the Atari 800 version. I mean, fact check me on this, but the game looks worse on PC, but better on the other, but more like Ultima 1 on the other types of computers. But, all in all, the gameplay was kept similar. You have a new adventure. There's some new fun things to figure out. You kind of have the same thing going on where you need to have hit points and food and weapons and some, moderate RPG elements going on. You add more dialogue with more characters kind of thing. But there's not a whole lot of that going on still by Ultima 2. By Ultima 3, Garriott said, well, let's take the Ultima thing, and let's make it so that you have a party of characters, kind of like, one of the dungeon crawlers of the time, Wizardry or Bard's Tale or something like that. And that way you get, multiple characters with multiple skill sets. That might be fun. So he does that. And again, you've got your same kind of top-down thing, occasional first-person dungeon kind of things. You make the battles a little bit more complex. You add a little bit more detail here and there. But you can see that there's kind of like a very step-by-step progression of the Ultima series as it gets a little bit more complex each time, but always kind of sticks with a similar image that people can look at and say, ooh, that's familiar, and I like that, right? Ultima 4 changes the goal system entirely. This was a big change, right? Because up until that point, the Ultima series had kind of just been like a hack and slash. Ultima 4 was Richard Garriott saying, okay, I've made some money off of this, I've got a bit of an audience, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make the goal of the game not, killing some, big bad guy or winning a bunch of fights necessarily. I'm going to make being a good guy in other ways kind of the goal of Ultima 4. And so he created Quest of the Avatar. And, it was a risk because he was changing something. He was saying, well, we're going to move further away from hack and slash and more into kind of a kind of cerebral-ish thing. There's more characters to deal with. There's a little bit more writing involved. A little bit more depth to characters. Very, but still you have that same top-down with first-person dungeons thing going on. And you have, a similar world. You have the world with some similar characters that you remember from earlier games as well. The point is that the Ultima series went all the way from, part 1 all the way up through part 8 and then concluded in part 9. But even in part 8, you still have primarily this overhead view, it became more isometric later on, right? But you still have kind of this overhead view, and you still have kind of similar story elements, and you still talk about, you add more details to the characters, you add more details to the world, you increase the world building, but at no point did Ultima change from, at no point did Garriott try to change Ultima from, a interesting CRPG to an action game or something like that. There were a couple of mild action elements here and there, but in general, it maintained an audience over time. And, that's part of why it was so successful over such a long period of time, right? Eight games in the series, plus a couple of spin-offs, is nothing to sneeze at. So that's kind of like my Ultima case study. Case study is a strong word for it, but kind of like, okay, so you get an audience and you keep building that audience and you add little improvements here and there and you make the graphics a little bit better to try to kind of draw people in. That's another thing Tim Cain mentions, is that graphics are a draw, right? And he's right in the sense that, like, if the gameplay of the sequel is still similar and still good, right? People are going to say, "Oh, okay, well, it's been 2 years since the previous one. I'll give the sequel a try." And then what you do is graphics are constantly kind of on this upward slope, and if you just go if you take the trend where your first game went and you just go a little bit higher up, maybe you catch some eyes from other people and you bring in a little bit more new audience, but you still never betray the old audience. Let's look at a different case study. Fallout. Tim Cain, right? Fallout 1 and 2. They are isometric, CRPGs. They have kind of a satirical take on kind of the wasteland mythos kind of thing. Post-apocalyptic, radiation, mutants, all that fun stuff. Sorry about that. You have Fallout 1 and 2. Fallout 2 is very similar in appearance to Fallout 1. But it has a lot of similar story elements. It's telling a continuation of the same story, some new characters, some new places to visit, but the overall aesthetic remains. But then we had the move from Fallout 2 to Fallout 3. And of course the company changed, right? I forget. I'm blanking on the name of the company, but basically Bethesda bought the rights and they made Fallout 3. And that's a gamble. And what they did with it is they decided, let's try to take the CRPG audience, because CRPGs have always been a bit niche, right? There's a certain small group of people that's willing to spend hours and hours and hours in a relatively slow-paced role-playing situation. But at the time, first-person shooters were really, really popular, and so Bethesda said, well, let's try to draw in some of that larger first-person shooter audience and maintain the old CRPG audience. So what they did, they changed the style of the gameplay quite significantly. But what they did try to do, for the most part, was they tried to maintain the same kind of lightly satirical tone, a lot of callbacks, similar kind of storyline, similar kinds of characters, a new area to explore. But, they kind of tried to translate the CRPG isometric top-down gameplay of Fallout 1 and 2 into a first-person kind of perspective. A lot of the world elements are, new, but similar enough that what they hoped to do was keep much of the audience from the old CRPG version by maintaining RPG elements in the game, but also to draw on a larger, more kind of action-oriented group, and kind of to serve both of those audiences. It was a gamble. It was a huge gamble. But because they maintained a certain amount of loyalty to the Fallout 1 and 2 storylines, they maintained their audience. They improved their audience, and then they continued with Fallout 4, and then they contracted out Fallout New Vegas kind of thing, or licensed out. I forget exactly how that exactly worked. But the point is that what they're doing is they're gathering data, they're applying that data to potential sequels, they're making gambles, but they're making gambles while trying to maintain maintain the previous audience as well. So I mentioned earlier that Tim talks a little bit about better graphics as a draw. Yeah, this affects the possibility of increasing the size of your market. But again, your existing market is still more solid information than people who are saying, like, well, if it looked prettier, I might buy it. They haven't demonstrated anything yet. They've just said stuff. Tim talks a bit about the vagueness of what better graphics mean, and how there's a lot of different elements that go into this, like resolution, variation of environments, variation of characters. And it kind of reminded me, him talking about this kind of reminded me of trying to, he talks about how difficult it is to serve multiple different groups of people, and how some people want the opposite of what other people want. And this is one of those things where, looking at survey data, people who have said, I want this, but I haven't paid anything yet, right? Looking at that data is kind of like, It reminded me of like there's that Family Guy episode from like season 2, I think, where Peter Griffin is like putting, and he just keeps putting around in a circle around the hole. He's like, damn, 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 mulligan, damn, damn. And that's what you can get. That's what you can get tricked into if you spend a lot of time looking at survey data rather than actual demonstrated preferences. You end up saying, well, this guy wants this, and this guy wants this. Well, this guy bought the previous game, right? This guy did not. So we look for the people that bought the previous game. We try to make sure that we're still serving their purposes, still being, loyal to what they think the game is about. We make some changes, we make some improvements, but but the people who've actually put down money in the past are the ones whose opinions are really important. Otherwise you can get confused and just have people from all directions just screaming contradictory things at you, and that's not very good for entrepreneurial, calculation. I mean, the point is that if what you do is you try to kind of advance at a similar or even slightly elevated rate compared to the rest of the industry, you can often expect to hold an audience as long as you're not like putting out a game every 2 months, right? The underlining fact is that don't betray your existing audience. Don't betray the people that are already paid money for the previous thing that you made, or something like what you made, kind of thing. This is the purpose of entrepreneurship in the production of these large, roundabout, commercial entertainment things, right? It's like, well, a lot of people love Legend of Zelda. There hasn't been a Legend of Zelda in X years. Why don't we do something like that? Well, what kind of audience can we expect? Well, if we do this and do this and do this, then we can expect. Let's say that we expect. We'll look at there was a spinoff that did this and this and this, and they got 30% of the yield of the audience of the Zelda audience, right? So if we do this, and this, maybe we can get 40%, right? This is what entrepreneurship is for, and I don't expect Tim Cain to know a lot about entrepreneurship, but at the same time, I think that it's worth at least highlighting some of the things that he didn't talk about and kind of try to make a little bit more sense, because it's not true that devs don't know what gamers want. It is true that devs know what gamers have wanted in the past, and that data is way more useful than just people yelling on YouTube comments. So, conclusions. Tim Cain, perhaps, reasonably, because he's maybe not aware of it, and to be fair, a lot of professional economists downplay the importance of entrepreneurship in the economy, right? Tim Cain is kind of ignoring the role of entrepreneurship and the value of real sales data in his video. There's too much focus on stated rather than revealed or demonstrated preferences. This can be paralyzing. It can pull you down a road of trying to serve people whose only investment in your series is a 3-second comment on YouTube that they'll never read again, right? This is the person whose investment is not worth anything yet, as opposed to the person who put down $50 2 years ago on a similar game something that you're trying to produce. Look at the difference in the investment of the two different potential customers. One of them is in for there's the saying, in for a penny, in for a pound. One of them is in for $50, and that would be, that's a lot of pounds, right? I think a mistake that a lot of these big studios make is that they, become large off of some great series that they've kind of, shepherded through the years, and then they assume that all of their products must be similarly large, similarly expansive, and they start throwing lots and lots of money at things that have no proven actual sales behind them, but rather just people like, I want a game that does this, and they don't actually play video games, they don't actually buy video games, they're just making a 3-second comment on YouTube because the algorithm sent them to one of your videos. I guess the takeaway is that if you are happen to be in one of these, thankfully, one of these blessed companies that have actually managed to make a major profit from some of your game series, use caution with new ideas and give the good ones room to grow. Try a lot of different things with smaller budgets until you can demonstrate that there's actually an audience for something. The Vampire Survivors model rather than I don't even remember, than the Avowed model, right? Something like that. Focus focus more, from an entrepreneurial perspective, you want to focus more on what has sold, not what people say they want, right? Because there's that old quote, right, from Henry Ford, that if, I'm going to butcher, I'm not going to quote him, but like I'm going to refer to it in the sense, he said something along the lines of, well, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have just said faster horses, right? But I gave them the car instead. Creative genius has a place in the production of these things, right? Some of them are labors of love, works of art. And those creative geniuses should be nurtured, right? But at the same time, a lot of people can masquerade as a creative genius, and so don't give them huge amounts of resources until they've actually proven that they can actually do something useful. A game IP, from a free market economics perspective, intellectual property is kind of not a thing, right? But we live in a world where it is, whether we prefer that or not, right? And so you have to think of a game property as a capital good. It often has to be built up gradually, just like any other capital good, right? You don't build a factory for a new device before you've shown whether anyone wants to buy it. You build, a prototype. You build, a mock-up. You actually get people to, buy versions. You handcraft a couple, right, of this new gadget, and then you say, well, what would you pay for this gadget? And the guy says, I'll give you $50. And you're like, okay, cool, $50. Well, we've got that guy's a market. Does anyone else buy it? And maybe nobody does, right? And you're like, okay, well, nobody else wants this gadget except this one weirdo. Fair enough. There might not be a market for that gadget. But if you make a couple of these gadgets kind of, in an inefficient way to begin with, and like everyone is like 50, 60, 70, 80, they're bidding it up kind of thing, then you might have something. And so, in the same way that you would take that capital that you're getting for that new gadget and build a workshop, and then from a workshop to a factory, and then from a factory to multiple factories, you start with a small game, you build it up into something that people like and know and want to pay money for, and you build it up bit by bit until it actually becomes a juggernaut. You can't just pull a juggernaut out of thin air because, it either needs to have a lot of star power behind it, which can work, right? Like if you say, we're going to market this game as something made by John Romero, right? It's like big name. We're going to do that. It's going to be really good. That can work out. I'm not going to say that hasn't worked out. But at the same time, you can end up with something that maybe is a fun game, but doesn't have enough market penetration to make a profit for a large budget. Capital goods have to be built up over a long period of time. If a game IP is a capital good, and it certainly seems like it is, at least in the existing world of patents and copyrights and trademarks, then building it up gradually is really the wise way to do it, as opposed to saying, oh, I have a new mousetrap. Let's build a factory and build 1 million of these mousetraps and spend $100 million. And then it turns out that the mousetrap doesn't actually trap mice. You'd have a bit of a problem. Anyway, that's what I got for today. I hope you enjoyed my kind of application of economics to the production of commercial entertainment. Don't betray your audience. Don't betray your audience. Don't betray your audience. And people that have paid money, their opinions are worth more than people who are just putting a 3-second YouTube video up. That's what I got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you all next time, probably with that Kropotkin Chapter 3 on anarcho-communism. And ooh, it's a doozy. Anyway, have a good couple of days, and I'll see you soon. Have a good one.